Thank you for the introduction, Vince. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first time participating in a Pizza and Politics event. And to be honest, it's been many years since I've given a public speech, so I am a little nervous, so bear with me. But anyway, my name is Karina Geranios. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a senior at Dixie State University studying population health. I have goals to go attend graduate school in epidemiology, so I'm really passionate about all things public health. I'm currently president of DSU's Students United for Reproductive Freedom Club. So I work for Planned Parenthood, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in my presentation. So I'm really excited to share with you guys an overview of sex education in Utah. Okay, so I'll start off by defining what is sex education. So essentially the purpose of sex education is to provide individuals with the information, skills, and the motivation to make informed, healthy decisions about sex and sexuality. So it's important to note that not all sex education is comprehensive, and we'll go into that a little bit further later on in the presentation about what comprehensive sex education entails. And then another note is that Planned Parenthood is the United States' largest provider of sex education in the United States. They annually reach about 1.2 million individuals. So I'll talk further about their role in this presentation as well. Okay, so what does sex education look like in Utah public schools? So the state education agency and local education agencies possess the authority to choose or approve curriculum related to sexual health education, HIV prevention, and STD prevention in Utah public schools. Utah is one of about 7 opt-in states, so parents and guardians must be provided the opportunity to opt in their children to participate in learning these topics. So they must sign a permission slip allowing these students to participate in learning about sex ed. And then abstinence is also highly emphasized in Utah state curriculum. So in essence, Utah is really an abstinence plus state. So states that have implemented abstinence-only education, I'll kind of step back and define that a little bit. So it's really sexual activity outside of the context of marriage is likely to have harmful psychological and physical effects. That's what abstinence-only education proponents claim, and that they also claim a mutually faithful monogamous relationship is the context of marriage. In the context of marriage is the expected standard of human sexual activity. So if you grew up in Utah or a state that emphasized abstinence-only education in schools, you might have heard these talking points highly emphasized. So abstinence-only programs are kind of now being rebranded as sexual risk avoidance programs, but they basically mean the same thing. So they're kind of moving away from that language to sexual risk avoidance. So in Utah, this is kind of an overview of the abstinence plus guidelines that they follow. So curriculum must stress abstinence, and then sexual health information must be medically accurate, which is good. However, curriculum is not required to cover sexual orientation or gender identity. It is also not required to include instruction on consent. And again, parents must opt in their children to participate in sex education. So if parents don't sign that permission slip, these students are missing out on crucial sex ed. So these are kind of the core topics addressed as per Utah law. So sexual health education is required, as I stated previously. However, HIV prevention and STD prevention are not necessarily covered. And I'll go into that in a little bit more depth in future slides as to why that is. So here are some Utah law facts. These figures are pulled from the CDC's website from 2018. The first figure is 69% of secondary schools provided those who teach sexual health education with strategies that are age appropriate, relevant, and actively engage students in learning. So as you can see, there's about 31% of students missing that critical engaged learning opportunities in Utah schools, and that's from 2018 again. So those figures might look a little different now, but I doubt it. And then furthermore, 90% of secondary schools taught how HIV and other STDs are transmitted in a required course during grades 9 through 12. Okay, and then some stats about Utah in general. So approximately 1 in 11 Utah teens will experience dating violence. And 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. Moreover, marginalized Utahns do face a number of barriers due to the lack of systemic support for their sexual health. So especially young people of color, LGBTQ young people, as well as adolescents with differing abilities or disabilities. I do want to make a note in that there's a large gap for students receiving special education. A lot of teachers special education teachers aren't necessarily trained in providing sex ed, so a lot of those students do end up missing out on that. So that's just one example of the disparity present in not just Utah, but the United States overall. Additionally, LGBTQ students are more than twice as likely than their heterosexual peers to experience partner violence, sexual assault by a partner, and being forced to have sex. Another figure that's not on here is about lesbian and bisexual students are about twice as likely to have an unintended pregnancy in their teen years compared to heterosexual teens. So ultimately, sexual violence is a major public health issue in Utah. So sexual assault and rape is the only violent crime in Utah that is higher than the national average. So Utah, we tend to have lower crime rates with regard to robbery, aggravated assault, and homicide. However, rape is that outlier. So that's definitely a characteristic of a major public health issue in Utah that needs to be addressed. So to address that, the Utah Department of Health have outlined priority risk as well as protective factors for preventing sexual violence in Utah. So those priority risk factors in Utah are that societal norms supporting violence and sexual violence, as well as the adherence to traditional gender norms in Utah kind of play a major role in this statistic being here. And then as well as protective factors that can help combat this public health issue is gender equity, the association of pro-social peers and building those relationships with peers, skill solvings of problems in a nonviolent manner, as well as community support and connection. So I'm going to talk a little bit about legislative developments. I'll let Bob speak further about the law, but this is just kind of an overview of some changes that have happened recently in Utah. So in 2016, Senate Bill 196 was passed, which removed the prohibition of instructors discussing homosexuality in a positive manner. So this actually came to fruition after Equality Utah sued the state school board in several districts. So a lot of states in that time frame also passed similar laws. And then in 2018, House Bill 286 passed, which required instruction of refusal skills and the harmful effects of pornography. So it's somewhat of a step in the right direction with regard to that, but yeah, I'll talk further about that too in the presentation. In 2019, it was a bit of a busy year. Legislators passed House Bill 71, which allows educators to provide instruction on the medical effectiveness of contraceptives, so that was a great win, because before, contraceptives were not really discussed in sex ed at all in Utah. However, educators are not permitted to encourage or advocate for the use of contraceptive methods, so that's a big distinction that has to be made. Also in 2019, the Utah State Board of Education updated the core state standards for health education to offer further guidance on the topics of affirmative consent, contraceptive methods, reproductive conditions and diseases, relationship violence prevention, and the identifying of credible, accurate sources about sexual health. I do want to make a side note with regard to those topics. Those, just because they're in the guidelines of the Utah State Board of Education, it doesn't mean they're necessarily being covered in schools. A lot of districts, they differ a lot in their sexual education delivery methods. So moving on, you guys may have heard about this bill. It was House Bill 177. It was introduced earlier this year in 2021. So it aims to enhance sex education in Utah by teaching middle and high schoolers the following: what constitutes consent, sexual violence behavior prevention education, and resource information for sexual assault survivors. But younger students who would learn about consent would learn really about body safety, boundaries, and communication. Again, parents would have to opt in to this sort of lesson as well. So unfortunately, this was defeated earlier this year. It is being held in committee for undergoing several changes from its original version. Hopefully, it will be reintroduced during this next legislative session, but we'll have to see. Okay, so here are some facts about where Utahns in general stand. So overall, 43% of Utahns, and this was a poll conducted by the Salt Lake Tribune, by the way. So 43% of Utahns strongly support sex education beyond abstinence only. And then if you look at the somewhat support over that, the 43% strongly support and 25% somewhat support, that's a large margin of voters at least somewhat support some sort of reform in sex education. And then this poll was done by Planned Parenthood, and basically it breaks down the different topics related to sexual education. So nearly universally, Utahns think it is important that young people learn medically accurate information about STD, HIV, AIDS, healthy relationships, consent, and birth control. So if you look at the breakdown of this graph, sexually transmitted diseases, 73% strongly agree that it is important for young people to have medically accurate information, and 96% at least agree. So you can see that breakdown of the different topics there. And then here's some more stats about where Utahns stand. So almost 2/3 of Utahns prefer medically accurate sex education curriculum in Utah schools. And over half favor comprehensive sex education, which again I'll define in the future slides. And nearly 2/3 of Utahns prefer medically accurate sex education curriculum in schools. And I already said that part, but 65% of Utahns believe students should be getting more information about sexual health, including but not limited to healthy relationships, STIs, and birth control. So again, an overwhelming majority of Utahns do prefer that we have some sort of reform in sex ed. So now we get to what is comprehensive sex education. So it covers a broad variety of topics related to sex and sexuality. It provides the skills needed to navigate relationships and manage sexual health, and it can take place in a variety of settings, schools, communities, and online platforms. So here are some topics of comprehensive sex education and what they cover. So human development, so puberty, reproduction, sexual orientation and gender identity, relationships, different family dynamics and structures, friendships, romantic relationships, and dating. Personal skills such as communication, negotiation, and decision making. Sexual behavior, abstinence, as well as sexuality throughout life. And sexual health, covering sexually transmitted diseases, pregnancy and contraception, and then society and culture, gender roles, diversity, and sexuality in the media. So presently in Utah, we cover about maybe half of those topics, mostly related to human development, a little bit of relationships, mostly peer relationships, and sexual behavior, namely abstinence, is what's emphasized in our curriculum, and then to some extent sexual health. So I'm going to outline some evidence-based practices. So this STOP sexual violence method is as outlined by the CDC. So STOP stands for Promote Social Norms That Protect Against Violence. T is Teaching Skills to Prevent Sexual Violence. O, Provide Opportunities to Empower and Support Girls and Women. And P, Create Protective Environments. So curriculums that have implemented this program have seen a lot of great results in preventing sexual violence and bringing awareness to it. So this is a good thing that could be incorporated into Utah's curriculum. Another thing I wanted to talk about is consent fries. So this is something that's easy to remember, and even for young children. So when we talk about consent, it's not just in the context of sexuality. Consent is something we give every day, right? For children, it's important for them to maintain bodily autonomy and not feel pressured, for instance, to hug a stranger. So consent is something we give and take every day. So it's freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Okay, and then moving on, I do want to show you this map. It can be kind of surprising for some people. So what this map shows is the United States breakdown by state of teen birth rates. So the white colors are the ones with really low birth rates, and then the darker red denote high teen birth rates. So if you look, New England, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Washington all have very low teen birth rates. But if you look at southern states, they tend to have higher teen birth rates. And now there are a lot of factors contributing to teen pregnancy rates, but One common denominator among these states is that they have a more comprehensive sex education model. And this is where I talk more about that. So according to a couple of huge studies, what we extrapolated from those studies is that sex education, including information about both contraception and abstinence, help young people delay sex, which is kind of interesting. A lot of people think that if we teach kids about contraception and do the full comprehensive sex ed model, that kids will have more sex, but that's actually not the case. More students are more likely to delay sex. They also are more likely to avoid STDs, avoid unintended pregnancies, increase their use of condoms or contraceptives, and reduce their sexual risk-taking. So really what that comes down to is that a comprehensive sex ed model works. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Planned Parenthood's role in sex education. So Planned Parenthood in Utah, a lot of people think they're limited to just providing medical services, but they actually hold a lot of workshops and training programs. So in Utah specifically, they address the gaps in sexual health education by offering year-round programs, one-day workshops, and a series of sex education classes. So these are just some of the examples of professional development and year-round programs. I'm not going to go over them one by one, but you can kind of get an idea. It covers a wide range of topics and targets a diverse population. And these are some of the one-day workshops and series that are offered. So yeah, you can take a look at that. I know they're going to be updating their website soon to be more reflective of what's going on. Because with COVID, a lot of things changed, of course, with the types of workshops that are offered. So be on the lookout for that if you're interested in participating in one of these. Okay, so here's our call to action. So if you feel like Utah could use better sex education, there's some things you can do. So you can give public comment at the Utah State Board meetings. The next meeting is actually Thursday, November 4th. You just need to give them notice that you're going to be making a comment, but that's something you could do to show your support for a more comprehensive sex ed model. Secondly, you can contact your local lawmakers and let them know that you support sex education reform in Utah and urge them to support this House Bill 177 that was defeated. That would be really transformative in moving towards a more comprehensive model in Utah. Number 4, you can contact Planned Parenthood to request an education session. So as I discussed in the previous slides, these sessions can be tailored to fit the needs of really any population. So if you're interested in doing that, I can send you guys a link, or if you go to Planned Parenthood's website and click on the education tab, you can find the form to fill that out. And then lastly, you can also join DSU Students United for Reproductive Freedom, or SURF Club. I'm the president of the SURF Club, so you can contact me at surfdsu@ppau.org, or you can find us on the club platform Blazer link if you're interested in joining. We do a lot of fun activities. We do sexual health education. We distribute things like condoms, tampons, things like that to the community, and we're a great resource, I think. So we're going to do the Q&A at the very end, but these are my references, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation and this topic about sex ed and the importance of reforming it in Utah public schools. Thank you.
Is this on now?
You gotta hold it down.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is Bob Weinstein. I hope to see some of you in my con law class next semester. It's awfully hard to summarize sex education in schools in 15 minutes because it's all over the board and it's very localized. Each school board essentially can mandate their own policy, provided that it follows the state statutes. The Trump administration moved away from the Obama teen pregnancy program and poured most of their money into abstinence-related programs. They cut off a lot of the funding in the teen pregnancy program of Obama. And the Trump administration emphasized the need to embed sexual delay in sex education. All the states have widely disparate approaches to sex education. And you can see this hotbed of activity in school boards now around the country. What used to be independent school board members are now running on virtually party platforms, progressives and conservatives, on everything from critical race theory to mask mandates, to sex education, and more recently now, gifted student programs, claiming that that just exacerbates the divide between white and minority students. But school boards normally have a lot of discretion at the end of the day. And the majority of the states regulate the teaching of sexual education in public schools. A couple of comments on the bill that was defeated. I think it was the rejection by a number of conservatives who believe that consent teaches students that it's okay to have sex. At least that's the argument. The contrary view is that the more you can inform youth about sex, it's the best way to protect them. I personally think that there would be some constitutional problems even if the Utah statute that was defeated in committee were passed. And that's because of this. Ever since Brown v. the Board of Education, the desegregation case, the courts have largely deferred to the ability of a school board to decide their own curriculum. And you can either, for example, opt in or opt out in most of these programs in sex education. And the court will largely say, well, you know, we're not going to touch how these programs unfold, be they absence only or more comprehensive, provided there's an opt-out or an opt-in provision for parents. The bill that was defeated mandated instruction in coercion, sexual violence, sexual assault, and covered grades 7 to 12. I think that might create a problem if that statute was ever enacted and tested in court, because it mandates rather than the opt-in or opt-out. And remember, Utah is really conservative on that. Utah's program on sex education is not opt-out, it's opt-in. So unless you want your child to be in, they're automatically out of sex education. Now, it's also interesting to note that Utah rape is the only violent crime that is higher than the national average. In fact, Utah has a scourge of unwanted sexual violence. Recently, 1 in 7 children have experienced sexual violence in Utah. 77.6% have had forced intercourse. On college campuses in the state, the level of groping and sexual misconduct has tripled in the last several years. But still, Utah state schools teach so-called refusal skills to prevent sexual attacks. Some opponents think, you know what that does? It puts the onus on the victim rather than the perpetrator. Others say kids know how to say no. It's the perpetrator that won't listen. Many claim that refusal is fine and adding consent is unnecessary. Now, some states have limited what sexual education programs can teach to certain principles only. Utah, for example, requires that abstinence, typically until marriage, must be emphasized as the best way to prevent diseases whenever sexually transmitted disease prevention is taught in schools. Well, let's look at that. Most Americans favor sex education. The statistics are national that 50% of females and 56% of males have intercourse between the ages of 15 and 19. That has resulted in over 1 million pregnancies of teenage girls, 80% of which are unwanted. In addition, HIV and AIDS are again on the rise, as is sexually transmitted diseases. 19 states currently require some form of sexual education other than abstinence. Yet, in many of these states, you can never mention intercourse, masturbation, abortion, or homosexuality. Opponents say, well, you know, you're usurping parental rights and you're encouraging immoral behavior. Those that favor abstinence say, you know, you're violating my human rights, my religious beliefs, my right of due process. And by the way, those who are opposing abstinence only say, what you're doing here is withholding medically accurate information that I want my child to know about. And the stigma of excluding gay children and reinforcing harmful generational stereotypes. And last but not least, as you've heard already, a deleterious impact on public health. So there are many arguments as to why abstinence only is not the answer. Now, Utah provides limits on what may be taught regarding contraception. It permits contraceptive education, but prohibits or advocating or encouraging the use of contraceptives. Abortion, most states are silent on the issue of abortion in their state statutes because they have other statutes they use to address that issue. But the key again, if you want to remember something from this, is the opt-out or opt-in provision. Because you see, that allows parents to remove their children from the classroom during sex education instruction for religious, moral, or family reasons. Opt-in provisions, on the other hand, require affirmative parental assent, as in Utah, and it slips before children can participate. You have to have a consent slip, and that's Utah Code Annotated. The Me Too movement has had an effect on the law. There are many conversations now about sexual assault and abuse, and they're pervasive in the media. Maryland recently introduced a bill requiring instruction of affirmative consent that's unambiguous, involuntary agreement. Michigan introduced a yes means yes bill for females. So, what is the law on this? There really are no federal laws as such that regulate sexual education in schools. So, it really takes place at the state and local level. Most of the legal challenges, the case law, so to speak, revolve around the relationship between public education and parental decision-making and religious freedom. And that's the balance. Just think about that if you were a judge. How are you going to come out on that? A parent's right and the need for public education. Many challenges have directed targeted statutes or programs requiring participation in sex education, while others have challenged laws limiting the accessibility or program content of sex education. Now, these are challenged on various constitutional grounds: religious freedom, right to privacy, and parental control over education. Generally, courts have found sex education and family life programs constitutional when, as I said before, there's an adequate provision to opt in or opt out based on morally conscious or religious objectionable beliefs. So let's look at a couple of cases. In Smith v. Ritchie, the Supreme Court of New Jersey upheld the State Board of Education's regulation requiring local school districts to develop family life education programs. On appeal, the appellants argued that because the regulations required their children to learn about human reproduction, sexuality, and the development of personal and social issues, it exposed them to beliefs contrary to their religion and interfered then with their practice of religion. But the court found, and I know by now you know this because I've mentioned a number of times, because there was a provision that you could withdraw your children from the program, it was constitutional. The decision highlights the delicate balance courts have struck between the recognized right of parents to direct education and upbringing of their children and the strong interest of the state and local principalities in providing effective education and mental welfare. And so you start out with this proposition. The courts almost unanimously say that school systems have the right to develop their own curriculum, their own sex education programs, provided they're consistent, for example, with what the Utah statutes have. And they're not going to go in there and say your curriculum is improper, with one exception that I'm going to get to, unless there is no opt-out or opt-in provision. Parental control, the courts argue, is outweighed by the state's interest in providing effective education or protecting the public health of their children. Now here's a case that I kind of like. It's called Brown v. Hot and Sexy. There, parents came in and claimed that the material provided in sex education was lewd, contained defensive monologues, and advocated for oral sex, masturbation, same-sex, condom use, premarital sex. The First Circuit, and this is the circuit right below the United States Supreme Court on appeal, held that a one-time sex education program performed at an assembly did not violate the student's right to privacy, due process, or religion. The plaintiffs had claimed that the school violated their 14th Amendment privacy right to rear their children in accordance with their values. The court rejected that. It said, look, parents can choose to enroll their children in a different school, but they do not have the right to command school systems to change their curriculum. Now that's pretty far out to say if you don't like it, change schools. But nevertheless, there is this authority that we're not going to monkey around with curriculum, provided there's an opt-out or opt-in provision. The court reasoned that if the individual parent had a fundamental right to dictate the school program, then schools would be unduly burdened by having to fashion a curriculum for each student, rather than applying one standard for all. Then we go to Liebert v. Harrington. This is a Connecticut case. Challenged the health and hygiene education requirement that included sexual health. The school's program allowed parents to opt out their children from the 6-day sexual health unit, but did not from the rest of the 45-day program. This was a group that would come into the school for it, and the rest of the faculty referred to them as the sex ladies that would come in and teach. After exempting a child from the sexual health program, a father still challenged the validity of the entire program by saying it violated his right of religious freedom and privacy guaranteed by the First and 14th Amendment. The Second Circuit, which is again includes New York, the East Coast, right below the United States Supreme Court, ruled that plaintiff did not have a fundamental right to remove his son from the entire program, reasoning much like the court in Brown, the schools would be unduly burdened if they had to tailor each child's curriculum. The court also acknowledged that the school district's requirement that students attend sex health education classes was further in the state's legitimate interest in promoting the health and welfare of the children, and the state's program does pass the rational basis review. So here they upheld it, even if there wasn't necessarily an opt-out provision. But that is rather a minority view. Most of the courts that have addressed this issue hold that they're constitutional, provided there is this opt-out or opt-in. And then we have Parker v. Hurley. Here, the First Circuit affirmed a lower court ruling that dismissed a parent's challenge to public school curriculum that taught homosexuality as an accepted family style. The parents sued the school district after their children were presented with books that portrayed diverse families, including those of same-sex couples. The complaint alleged public schools were indoctrinating children with beliefs that same-sex relationships were contrary to their religious beliefs in violation of the First and 14th Amendment. The parents also reasoned that the school district did not provide them with prior notice of the books, so they did not exempt their children. The First Circuit ruled the exposure to the materials in dispute would not interfere with the parents' ability to raise their children in their religious belief, and the parents did have notice of the books as well as the school's intent to promote toleration of the same-sex marriage. And again, the court emphasized that parents cannot dictate an appropriate curriculum. Distinguishing the parents' free exercise rights and their children, the court also found the children's free exercise rights were not burdened. Because remember, the children have rights too. Now, there is one case that successfully challenged the curriculum, but it is an outlier for this reason. It's Citizens for Responsible Curriculum of the Montgomery County Public Schools. It's a California case, and it was an abstinence case. What they found is that the statutes had changed for more comprehensive sexual education in California, but this particular school board refused to change their curriculum. And so the court there held that they had to go back and redo it. So that was an attack on curriculum, but because it violated the statute. So let me summarize. The decisions in Citizens and Parker suggest that should required sex education or public curriculum explicitly endorse homosexuality and same-sex marriage. 2, ask students or parents to affirm those beliefs. Or 3, show preference for a particular religious group performing those beliefs. That would run afoul of the First Amendment. In Parker, the First Circuit found that the books at issue did not violate the free exercise clause because the school did not compel either the children or their parents to disavow their religious beliefs or promote particular religion through positive portrayals of same-sex marriage and homosexuality. So, in summary, here is what I would say. The cases that I cite that uphold most of these comprehensive sex education policies are on the East Coast. When you get further west or into the middle of America, you're going to find more restrictive cases and more restrictive statutes, as in Utah. The two coasts being far more liberal and reflecting the divide we have today in partisan politics. So, with that, I conclude. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed your pizza.
Thanks, Bob and Karina. I have a number of questions, but I kind of want to throw it out first to you all. Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for Mr. Weinstein.
Yes.
So, you talked about the consent laws and the bills that are coming up with the yes means yes, saying no. But what I'm interested in is similar to sodomy laws, how, from a legal perspective, how do we enforce that? Or are those bills just coming up to try to deter that behavior from happening?
That's a very interesting question for this reason. There's a United States Supreme Court case that holds that sodomy or same-sex activity, which is in southeastern United States, violated the right of privacy and was unconstitutional. Nevertheless, we still have laws on the books of many states, particularly in the South, that are anti-sodomy and anti-same-sex, and they are seldom enforced, but they're on the books.
I have a question. Are you aware of any cases where adolescents sued their parents for not taking their parental responsibility to teach their children about some of these issues. And just as an example, I had a student in one of my classes who got HPV when she was 16, and she was incredibly angry that her parents never told her how to prevent that.
Great question. The case law is split on that. Some claiming that the student does not have the standing to sue, to enforce the parents' religious beliefs if they are under age 18. Other cases have held, yes, they have appropriate standing and can sue. But you see, because most of the opt-in, opt-out are for parents, a lot of the courts dodge the issue by saying, well, no, we respect your beliefs, but it's up to your mom or dad.
My question's actually geared a little bit more towards Karina. Have you noticed working in Utah Public Health, and then also at our Booth and Wellness Center, and then the president of the club you're in, all these things you're in, have you noticed, due to the lack of sex education to young students, have you noticed now that as they're coming to like the Booth and Wellness Center, you're seeing that lack even just here in our community of DSU students?
That's a great question. So I can't speak for the Booth Wellness Center, except I do COVID case investigations. So we definitely, I think there's been, since classes are now in session and things, students are definitely making up for that, so to speak. So in my work with Planned Parenthood, we're definitely seeing increase in interest in contraceptives. I'm getting lots of questions related to sexual health and sexual reproduction and freedom and things like that, but I can't give you exact stats. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
So I'm Mitski, I'm the vice president of DSU's LGBTQ+ club, and I feel like before Karina was president of the Surf Club, I feel like it's the clubs who've been taking the brunt of the work of sex education. I know for Club Rush, the LGBTQ+ club was handing out condoms and kind of carrying the torch until Karina came. So I feel like I've seen a lack of sex education at Dixie State University, and especially seeing where these students are coming from these high schools that don't really teach comprehensive sex education. So I just wanted to go back to that. But
hi, I'm Morgan. I work at the Booth Wellness Center. I'm a counselor there. I figured I would help address this. So in research that was done specifically in southern Utah with therapists who saw people, and specifically therapists in this community, the top reason that they saw families or couples in therapy was sex. So take that as you will, that way. And then as for the other thing, the question that I think we also need to ask is, are parents adequately informed to educate their children? And maybe do they need a course? So just thoughts.
Yeah.
So this question is for Karina. What do you think the biggest or the next step is that needs to be done in the state of Utah in order to improve sex education, and who is the group or organization that needs to make that step?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I addressed in the presentation, House Bill 177, I think that would be an excellent step toward implementing comprehensive sex ed, because it emphasizes consent. And looking back at that statistic where sexual assault and rape are really high in Utah, I think that would be excellent to address that statistic, giving students the information about what consent entails, etc. The group that would best amplify that message, I think Planned Parenthood is one, Equality Utah. There's a number of stakeholders involved in that process that I think could help uplift that.
And this is for both of you. HB 177 had to go down for a reason. Bob, did it go down primarily, do you think, because people thought it would ultimately be unconstitutional? I know that you had kind of mentioned it with respect to, no?
No, I think that what I've read, Vince, is that it was a 7-4 vote, didn't get out of committee. And largely, the argument was, this is unnecessary because we already have consent in other statutes, vague, kind of unrelated, and it was just a frank recognition of the pushback that teaching consent means approving of sex, premarital sex. And so it was largely that reason. The constitutional challenge is largely a product of me.
I see. Trying to get that third case in the Supreme Court. Yeah.
Hey, I wonder if you have any statistics about how many parents opt in or opt out?
I actually don't have those statistics off the top of my head, but I will definitely look into that because that's an excellent
Because that
question.
seems like a kind of pivotal to this whole conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
I think just my own speculation is you'll find a higher percentage in the larger urban centers than in the rural centers of people opting in.
This question is for Karina. Does Planned Parenthood have a recommendation for the length of a course for sex education? And should it be taught every grade level within middle school and high school, or just once during middle school and high school?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Planned Parenthood believes that, they believe that parents should play a big role in teaching their kids sex ed, but of course, as we see in reality, that's not always the case. And they do believe that starting young is important, as far as like giving them the information about basic anatomy to start with, and what consent entails, as I've mentioned before, not just in a sexual context. But moving forward, yeah, middle school, and then high school, they do definitely support sex education in those grades. So kind of throughout the spectrum of K through 12, Planned Parenthood is a strong supporter of sex ed.
Any other questions? Well, we're kind of getting close to the time. I think we've got maybe a couple more minutes, unless there's another question out there. So you give us some action items and kind of things that we can do. I think we have a large group here that's largely kind of thinking the same way, and you were giving us some statistics about Utahns. We have strongly supported, like 43% and 25% supporting expanding education. But of course there's going to be concerns from the other side. And I never want us to just present something that is one-sided, and you both have kind of touched on these concerns. But what are the concerns? If we have this 60+% of people who want more expanded sex education, what are kind of the concerns that are pushing back so strongly? Or is it just the fact that the state legislature isn't representing that popular view?
Let me just comment first from a legal standpoint. You all know that there are two challenges to Roe versus Wade currently pending before the Supreme Court. One is the Texas statute, the other one is the Mississippi statute. The recent polls show that only 1/3 of Americans are anti-abortion. Only 1/3. And although America is becoming a far more secular society, most people now that you see in church or synagogue or mosque have my color hair. The policies of the Supreme Court are going way, way, way back towards religion. So even though we see a very secular America, we see a very religious-oriented United States Supreme Court, more and more permitting federal funding for religious activities, abortion rights. So that's why the court now is not viewed very favorably by Americans, because they're running against the grain. And so what you see as a result of that is conservative legislatures, largely controlled by Republicans, will enact these statutes, like abstinence only, for example, which is a conservative-based one, because that is something that they can get through and justify. Same thing in Texas.
What are your thoughts, Karina?
So, I think ultimately our current government is not representing what the people want. And not just in Utah, across the spectrum, as Bob was saying about abortion rights. And I don't want to speak too much on that because we're here to talk about sex education, but that's just one example of how we're not really being represented. And I really, really do think with a new generation coming in, we can start to see some positive changes with regard to better representation. But I do think work from the ground up, at a grassroots level, really is imperative in making that change. So.
Okay, great. All right, I think we're out of time, and just give them a little round of applause, please. And thank you so much for coming out. We have an event. We have a Pizza and Politics. I believe this one's going to be in the ballroom next Thursday. Is that correct? And so right over here, and it's going to be on critical race theory. So we hope to see you there. James Stein is going to moderate. Okay, thank you.